Welcome to part 7 of Presidents, Plutocrats, Paupers, and Populists. Now we're going to take a look at captains of industries or robber barons. Okay, so you've already heard me use the term captain of industry and robber baron a few times already, and I'm sure you're already wondering, what is the difference between the two? What sets one apart from the other? And I can sum up the difference between a captain of industry and a robber baron in just one word: connotation, right? What is the connotation of the word? A captain of industry is somebody that advanced society through industrial progress, who made the world better through his philanthropy, right? See, it has a positive connotation to it. Whereas a robber baron is somebody who ruthlessly made himself filthy rich by using the labors of the working class, right? Oppressing them and taking their labor and made himself stupid rich. Connotation: positive connotation, negative connotation. That's the difference between the two. Usually we can talk captain of industry or robber baron and be talking about the same guy. So I'll use a couple of examples here, beginning with John D. Rockefeller. John D. Rockefeller came from a family with some money, and in the Civil War he managed to purchase himself a substitute. And in Cleveland, Ohio in 1863, he and some partners built an oil refinery. In 1865, he bought his partners out and he began expanding it, and by 1870, this became Standard Oil Company of Ohio. He very quickly came to dominate all oil refining in the state of Ohio, and his process was very robber baron-ish, right? He did as he got more and more power in Ohio, what he would do is he would try and buy out the other refineries. If a refinery refused to sell to him, he'd tell them, say, here, you can have this. I'm offering this refinery. You can go retire in luxury, or you can not sell to me, in which case I'll undercut the prices on you, drive you out of business, and buy your refinery in bankruptcy court. So your choice is yours. You can either sell me your refinery and become rich, or I'll make you poor. And he did to many people, right? He quickly dominated all the oil refining in Ohio, and he began to move to other states. There he runs into some problems, though. Some states didn't allow you to operate a company from another state inside their state, Pennsylvania being one of those. In other words, Standard Oil Company of Ohio could not operate inside of Pennsylvania. It violated Pennsylvania state law. So what did he do? Create another company, Standard Oil Company of Pennsylvania. And in order to control these different companies he starts amassing, he created the Standard Oil Trust, so that his companies won't compete against each other, but instead would work in collusion with each other to put other companies out of business. And by doing this, he's going to create a monopoly on the oil industry, which, like I said, is going to have, by the 1880s, he is going to control 70% of the global oil supply and 90% of the oil in the United States, right? John D. Rockefeller is going to become one of the very first billionaire in the world. He's going to be the first person to surpass $1 billion in wealth. Now, that being said, very robber baron, right? But let's take a look at some captain of industry of him, too. All right, first billionaire. But by the time he died in 1937, he had pretty much given all of it away. He was down to $26 million. He was notorious for giving every man he met in his older stages of life. Anytime he met anyone, he would immediately give them a dime. Always give them a dime for their time, right? But he'd given away a lot of his money. He funded a lot of medical research. He helped eradicate ringworm, and he founded the University of Chicago, which will actually be one of the instrumental locations during the Manhattan Project during World War II, right? He did, however, gain the attention of a lot of detractors, including investigative journalists and the government itself, that began taking a look at this monopoly he created and saying, wow, that's not really promoting very fair business practices for any competition. And I guess that really is an understatement, right? When you control 90% of the American oil production, there is no competition, right? You control it all, right? In 1881, Henry Demarest Lloyd, who was an investigative journalist, is going to examine Standard Oil, and he's going to write an article about it called The Story of a Great Monopoly. He'll describe Standard Oil's methods as dishonest, and including things like fraud, intimidation, and the purchase of political influence, all at the expense of the customer. Henry Demarest Lloyd will state that America has the proud satisfaction of having furnished the world with the greatest, wisest, and meanest monopoly known to history. He claimed that Standard Oil owned 2 United States senators and had done everything to the Pennsylvania state legislature except refine it, right? Now, due to public pressure, because of people like Rockefeller and this growing, the growth of some of these super monopolies, in 1890, John Sherman, a senator from Ohio, that same one who was the hopeful presidential candidate that Garfield was stumping for, is going to introduce a piece of legislation called the Sherman Antitrust Act, right? The Sherman Antitrust Act will be signed into law by Benjamin Harrison, maybe the only thing this dude ever did, right? In which it would act and declare that every contract, combination in the form of a trust or otherwise, or conspiracy in restraint of trade or commerce among the several states or with foreign nations is to be declared illegal, right? So the idea was it's going to attack these monopolies and start breaking them up. But this is a federal law, and it's immediately going to be challenged in the courts. It's going to be challenged in the courts by a company called E.C. Knight and Company. In 1895, E.C. Knight and Company's case will be heard by the Supreme Court. E.C. Knight had recently acquired the American Sugar Refining Company, and in doing so had taken control of 98% of the U.S. sugar production, U.S. sugar supply. Again, very much a monopoly. Okay, but in this court case, the Supreme Court decided by 8-1 in favor of E.C. Knight, stating that the actual manufacturing process was a local activity, and therefore the Sherman Antitrust Act could not be applied to it because, as a federal law, it was only the Sherman Antitrust Act is guided by the Commerce Clause of the Constitution, which means any interstate trade. The trade has to go across state lines. Well, if manufacturing is a local activity, that's not crossing state lines unless your factory is literally on the border between two states. So, what is the Sherman Antitrust Act going to be used for initially? Well, initially it's going to be used to attack labor unions, kind of one of those unintended consequences. 12 of the first 13 convictions under the Sherman Antitrust Act are going to be to break up labor unions, the exact opposite of what the Sherman Antitrust Act was intended to do. Next, we have Andrew Carnegie, one that's often referred to, if Rockefeller is often referred to as a robber baron, Andrew Carnegie is often referred to as a captain of industry. He is the poster boy for the Horatio Alger stories. These are rags to riches, well, rags to respectability stories, right? Like strive to succeed and risen from the ranks, right? Andrew Carnegie came to the United States with his family from Scotland in 1848. He was 12 years old. He became a bobbin boy at a cotton factory, right? From these humble beginnings, he worked his way up to manage the Keystone Bridge Company, and finally, in the 1870s, at 38 years of age, he founded Carnegie Steel Company. There he began to monopolize the steel industry. And he was an innovator. Right? Anytime some kind of new process for steel manufacturing came along, like improvements to the Bessemer steel refining process or the open hearth system, which allowed you to cast large steel beams for things like skyscrapers and bridges, he would retool his factories. He would automate his factories too, as much as he can to lessen the amount of labor needed to produce the steel. Right? And this is why he came to dominate the steel industry, because whereas other steel manufacturers said it's really expensive to retool a factory, Carnegie would do it in a drop of a hat if he saw that there was profit to be made in it. Now, like I said, he was very concerned with his image and his philanthropy, and in fact that he would also be rich on the scale as Rockefeller, but he would give away $350 million of his wealth just to charity organizations. And by the time of his death, he would actually have given away 90% of his wealth. Very much wanted to promote that image of being a captain of industry. But there's some robber baron in here too. And we can really see this when we take a look at what happened at the Homestead plant. The Homestead plant in Pennsylvania was one of Andrew Carnegie's steel foundries, right? And Arthur Shadwell once described the Homestead plant this way. He said, if Pittsburgh is hell with the lid off, Homestead is hell with the hatches on, right? Okay, in 1890, the economy went into a downturn. We went into a recession, right? And the price of rolled steel products plummeted. Rolled steel dropped from $35 per ton to $22 per ton in 1892 alone. So in 1892, Andrew Carnegie was set with a problem. His Homestead plant had too many workers. His automations had made it where he didn't need nearly the number of workers he had. He had 3,800 men working there, and he maybe needed about 2,000 tops. But he couldn't get rid of them because of the labor union contract he had. The labor union was the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers. And in this labor agreement, even though there was only about 700 men who were members of that union, the union contract applied to all workers that worked in the plant. So he couldn't get rid of people. So he decided he needed to do something about it. He had to cut costs and he had to get rid of some of these workers. So what did he do? He hired a manager, Henry Clay Frick, right? He commanded his manager of the mill, Henry Clay Frick, to do something about the union there at the Homestead plant. But he waited until the summer. In the summertime every year, Andrew Carnegie would go back home to Scotland and spend the summer in Scotland. And the reason why he did that is so he can have Henry Clay Frick be the heavy, take care of all this, and meanwhile, he can keep his image squeaky clean because he's out of country at the time, right? So Henry Clay Frick is going to offer the union a new contract in which he cut their wages by 26%, a major cut in the wages. Needless to say, the labor union rejected the new contract. So Henry Clay Frick locked them out. He shut the plant down and he locked out the workers. And then he announced on June 25th, 1892, that he would only deal with individual workers in hammering out details on a contract. In other words, if you want to work in this plant, you need to drop any association you have with the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers and come and deal a contract with me personally, right? Now, the 3,800 men there, as I mentioned, there's only 700 plus that were members of the union. 300 of them will vote to strike. They'll all get together and collectively vote to stand together and strike. And on July 1st, they stormed the mill and sealed themselves off inside the foundry. Okay, so now you've got 3,000 guys that have barricaded themselves inside the steel foundry. That means Frick can't hire scab workers to go work in the plant. So what does he do instead? He hired 300 Pinkerton agents to try and take the plant back. And on July 6, 1892, they'll attempt to do that and a firefight will break out. When the gunfire was over, 3 Pinkerton agents had been killed and at least 9 of the strikers had been killed as well. But because violence had broke out, this allowed Henry Clay Frick to call on the governor of Pennsylvania. And he basically told the governor, he said, look, I've got a bunch of people squatting on my boss's land. They are trespassing and they have killed my employees. I need you to do something about it. And the governor does. Does he negotiate a settlement between the workers and the factory managers? No. He sends in 8,500 National Guardsmen to break the strike and get the men out of there. And by mid-August, Homestead was in full operation again using 1,700 scab workers, and none of the people that were involved in the strike were allowed to return to work at the Homestead plant.